Welcome to this latest episode of Canonically Speaking, a podcast which features a variety of individuals from different areas of canon law, in which they tell us something about themselves, the circumstances that led them along the path they followed, their particular interest in and their own contribution to canon law. Today my guest is Father James Bradley, who is Assistant Professor of Canon Law at the Catholic University of America in Washington, and a priest of the personal Ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham, which of course is a topic of great interest in its own right, given its recent introduction into canonical legislation, and we'll be talking about that a bit later on. Father James holds degrees in music, theology and canon law from Bristol, Oxford, London, and the Catholic University of America. And I understand, Father James, that you're currently undertaking a doctorate in Liturgical Studies at the University of Vienna. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right, yes.
Father James's own journey to the Catholic Church came via Anglicanism, so perhaps we could take that as a starting point for today's conversation. Could you talk a little bit about how you came to the Church?
Father Paul, first of all, it's a delight to see you and to have this opportunity to speak with you. And thank you for this great podcast, which is such a great addition to the world of canon law. So I was baptised in the Church of England as an infant and was brought up in the Church of England, going to our local parish, and went away to boarding school at the age of 7, at my own choice. It wasn't my parents forcing me. And from there, I went to be a chorister at Winchester Cathedral, where my interest in music began, and with it also my interest in religion. And I was singing in the cathedral there every day, and on Sundays 3 times a day, getting into the routine of the psalms and canticles and so on. And really from that love of sacred music came a love for Christ and his church. And over the years, I continued to think about what that meant for me. I was very fortunate at school to have a chaplain who encouraged all of that. And so I went forward eventually for ordination in the Church of England, and went to study theology at St. Stephen's House in Oxford. And I was there, in fact, studying to be ordained in the Church of England when Pope Benedict XVI announced the personal Ordinariates, the Apostolic Constitution, Anglicanorum, Coetibus. And so my whole journey towards Anglican ministry I see it as a trajectory that was ultimately towards ministry in the Catholic Church. And my time as an Anglican was greatly blessed in that regard, that I was sort of encouraged in that trajectory in implicit and explicit ways, from singing William Byrd as a 7-year-old to having Anglican chaplains who were encouraging of exploring these questions about what is the Church and who is Jesus Christ and what does it mean to be a priest and so on. So when the Ordinariate was announced, and I was still an Anglican seminarian, theological college student, it seemed to be, as they say, a no-brainer. And so I was glad to be part of that first wave of clergy from the Church of England. I was subsequently ordained in the Church of England and part of that first wave that came into the Ordinariate.
So the Ordinariate was announced in
2009, and there was an announcement in the October, and then the document appeared in early November. So it was signed on the 4th of November, the feast of St. Charles Borromeo, and then it was subsequently released, I think, on the 8th or the 9th of November of 2009, and that's when I was in the last year of formation for ministry in the Church of England.
And then you would encounter Pope Benedict the following year when he came to England.
Yes, that's right. The papal visit in 2010 was a very significant moment, I think, for lots of people, and particularly for those of us who had received with joy the announcement of the Ordinariate. But of course, at that stage, it hadn't been set up. So we were all waiting with bated breath to see what this structure would actually look like. And Pope Benedict's visits to England in the intervening months were a great encouragement. I had by that stage left theological college to go to serve my curacy in the Diocese of Rochester, which was at one stage John Fisher's diocese. And I went with a group of about 30 parishioners from our Church of England parish to the papal event at Hyde Park. And that was an astonishingly moving occasion for all of us. But for me, really, it was a moment where I realized the answer to that question of what is the church, because there was Christ present in the Blessed Sacrament on the altar, with the Holy Father kneeling before the altar, and the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament with the bishops of England and Wales and the priests and the deacons and the laity. And it was all set out before me wonderfully and in this liturgical and very tangible way. And I thought, gosh, that's the church, and I need to be part of it.
It was an astonishing event with 80,000 people kneeling in silence for a long time, 20 or 30 minutes in the middle of Hyde Park, in the middle of London. It was quite remarkable. So how did your particular relationship with the Ordinariate develop after that then?
So in September of 2010, when Pope Benedict visited, the Ordinariate at that stage didn't exist. And it was only at the end of that year, in fact, the first day of the next year, 1st of January of 2011, that the first people were received into what would become the Ordinariate. And it was announced in January of that year that it had probably been erected already, and the first clergy were ordained for it, and the first laity received into it. And at that point, a group of about 40 parishioners from the parish I was in Sevenoaks in Kent expressed a desire to come into the Catholic Church through this provision. And so we prepared them together with the local Catholic parish priest for reception. We left the Church of England on the Sunday before Ash Wednesday, and were received into full communion on Holy Thursday of that year, the 21st of April. And I would say probably of the 30 that came to Hyde Park, actually, probably about 25 became Catholics. And then there were some others as well who followed.
And what was it that led you then to specialise in canon law, since you had a musical and a theological training?
Well, two things, I think. First of all, and both stemming really from the fact that I was then ordained for service in the Ordinariate as a deacon and then later as a priest. And I think in that moment, realising that there was a real need in the Ordinariate for someone from within the Ordinariate to know canon law. We'd been greatly helped by a number of other canonists in the early months of preparation for and starting of the Ordinariate. But we realised, I think, that we needed to have our own homegrown canonists who understood the very particular questions that faced us, both particular in the sense of understanding the patrimony and the people involved, but also realising that we were essentially founding a new diocese, and that required quite a lot of thought and care. So I was asked to consider further study, and I was fortunate enough to be asked what I would like to study. And so between myself and Monsignor Keith Newton, who was the ordinary at the time, we settled on canon law. And I was very, very fortunate indeed to be able to come to Washington, D.C. At that time to study for the licentiate at the Catholic University of America. Cardinal Wall, who was the Archbishop of Washington at the time, was the delegate for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops for the implementation of Anglicanorum Coetibus, and so he looked kindly on the request and helped get me across the pond and be able to come and study here.
And so the Ordinariate is, in the life of the Church, a very recent development. Do you see it as still being in the process of finding its way? Do you see a clear path of development for the future?
Yes, certainly it's still very new, and I suppose those of us who have lived with it since its inception need to be reminded of that this is a relatively new endeavour, and so there's still lots to do and lots of ground to cover. But no, I do think that it's got a long way to go. I think we've achieved a great deal in a short space of time in England and Wales, in the Ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham, of over 100 clergy now who have come from the Church of England and been ordained for service in the Ordinariate. And I think the next stage is really the growth of the Ordinariate as such. In a sense, we've brought people over, but now we need to develop places for them to exist and to live and move and have their being. So parishes and communities that have greater stability and that can be centres for the very distinctive and beautiful liturgical life which we hold dear. So I think that's probably the next stage of development is the bedding down, as it were, of this first 13 or 14 years now of growth.
I do know from personal experience of some particular cases where the ordinariate in fact proved to be the solution for some Anglicans who'd previously felt that to become a Catholic would in some way be an act of disloyalty, I suppose, to their English background and upbringing. So Pope Benedict's initiative certainly did come at an opportune time for them and enable them to overcome whatever reticence they had to make the leap into the church and yet remain true to their English heritage. So I imagine you must know quite a number of such cases. On a more specifically canonical note, as regards the personal jurisdiction of the ordinary, what's your experience to date when it comes to coordinating with the local diocese, with the local bishop, in relation, for example, to the sacraments, baptism, marriage, and so on?
Well, right to say that personal ordinariates are relatively new in the church, but personal jurisdiction is not. And so we inherit a lot of the existing preoccupations and conversations around the relationship between personal jurisdictions and territorial jurisdictions, and we have to work through that in relation to what the ordinariates are and also to what the diocese is as well, obviously. So in my first place, I would say that we've had very good relations with most of the bishops and most of the clergy. There were obviously times when there's misunderstanding and so on, but on the whole, I think that's been a really successful relationship, and it's been a relationship, I think, in large part that's developed on trust and on mutual respect. I think the number of clergy that we have brought into for communion has helped with that. We've often been able to help dioceses with pastoral planning and so on and so forth by offering our priests to serve in both the diocese and our own ordinariate communities. We have, I think, to say more clearly and with greater he says, stumbling over his words, with greater articulation, what it means for us to be self-governing. The term that's often applied to personal jurisdictions is cumulative jurisdiction. And so, particularly with military ordinariates, this notion of cumulative jurisdiction, where both the military ordinary and the diocesan bishop exercise some degree of jurisdiction over the same matters, over the same people and places and so on. That's distinct with us. So our ordinary in England, Bishop Waller, has unique and exclusive jurisdiction over the subjects of the ordinariate, except in those places and circumstances where there is an agreement that exists between the bishop of the ordinariate and the bishop of the territorial diocese. So that's very specific. Those agreements are really key because they actually sort out the way in which the power of governance is exercised by both the diocesan bishop in relation to ordinariate subjects and the personal ordinary in relation to his own subjects. So I think we'll have to be much better at explaining that and how it's different from, for instance, the cumulative jurisdiction that's enjoyed by military ordinaries with local bishops.
Yes, because it could be very significant when it comes especially to marriage and who has jurisdiction.
Exactly. And with matrimonial tribunals, we don't have our own tribunal, and we're reliant on the local tribunals for that. But if at some stage that happened, we would need to be very careful about that.
Now, you have a background in music, and presumably this plays a significant part in the efforts of the Ordinariate to preserve the liturgical patrimony, the Anglican patrimony within the Catholic Church.
That's absolutely right. The musical patrimony is really at the heart of our liturgical patrimony, and both the kind of cathedral-style music, for which the Anglican tradition is well known, but also good quality parish music, robed choirs and singing of good hymns and so on and so forth in parishes. So that's been an important part of it. And for my own path, obviously started off as a musician, and that's where my love for the liturgy kind of developed as well.
Up to now, what have been your specifically canonical responsibilities within the Ordinariate? What roles have you held?
So to start with, after I returned from studies in Washington, I was serving in a parish in the Diocese of Portsmouth, and I also was the Vice-Chancellor for the Ordinariate. I would say that the main part of that work was advising at the level of the governing council and also of the ordinary on certain matters relating to establishing various entities and institutes in the life of the Ordinariate for the first time. So, for instance, we now have a vicar general and episcopal vicars and so on, starting to develop what it looked like to have a functioning chancery, together with my colleague Father Jonathan Redvers Harris, a very competent and energetic chancellor, and also working with the ordinary on more sensitive issues, some of those agreements in relation to parishes, what it looks like to be a personal parish in an ordinariate, what the statutes need to look like, and so on and so forth. And also some limited, I'm pleased to say, personnel and clergy disciplinary measures.
And can you talk about your current doctoral studies in Vienna?
Sure. So when I returned from my canon law studies, as I say, I went to be a parish priest, and I thought that was the end of my studies. I'd enjoyed canon law studies very much, and I looked forward to putting that to good use. But Monsignor Mouton approached me and asked whether I would be interested in joining this international research project at the University of Vienna, headed by Professor Hans-Jürgen Feulner, who was on the commission that put our Ordinariate liturgy together. And he is the chair of Liturgical Studies at Vienna, and he has put together this group of people who are at various stages now preparing doctoral dissertations on elements of the Anglican traditions in the Catholic Church. That's the title of the research project. So I've been part of that for a few years, and I've been able to continue that since coming back to Washington to join the Faculty of Canon Law as well.
What do you think the future holds for you personally? Have you got any idea of where you will be or what you will be doing?
No, not at all. I mean, I'm very glad to be in Washington, and I'm very glad to be at the School of Canon Law, and I'm very glad to be on the faculty here, teaching and having the opportunity to research. I've particularly enjoyed the opportunity to bring together these two interests of canon law and liturgical studies, and to think in particular about the interaction between liturgy and law, about sacramental discipline, liturgical norms, the role of the law towards the liturgy, and the need for those who are involved with canon law in relation to the sacraments and discipline of the liturgy and so on and so forth, to have a solid foundation in liturgical studies and sacramental theology as well.
Finally, we know that Pope Leo has a canonical background. Do you have any personal thoughts, observations, or hopes from this present pontificate as regards potential canonical developments?
I'm not sure that I would want to put my finger on any particular potential canonical developments, but I would say more broadly, I think his expertise in canon law and his background in canon law will give him certain insights into the way that governance should be done, and that I think can only be good. Cardinal Michels put it rather well after Pope Leo's election in a press conference. He said quite simply, he's got a doctorate in canon law, so he knows how things should be done. And I thought that rather nicely summarised it, that I say this to my students quite a lot, that in the civil realm, it's quite often the case that an attorney, a lawyer, will be present in the room when conversations happen. Not because they are necessarily needed there because they are doing something specifically legal, they're not drafting documents and so on, but because they have a way of thinking, a way of approaching questions and challenges. And I think that will bode well to have in the person of the Roman Pontiff and hopefully around him people who just understand systems, understand governance, understand basic principles of justice and so forth. I think that can only be good for the Church. And ultimately, I think that's why the Code, very sensibly in my view, encourages those who hold high office in the Church to have a background in canon law, either by a degree or being truly expert in the science, because it's necessary really for good governance. So I think it bodes well.
Well, that's a very helpful and wise answer. It's time for us to conclude today, but thank you very much, Father James, for your time and your reflections, and we wish you all the best with your studies, with your teaching, and with your preserving of the Anglican patrimony within the Catholic Church. So once again, thank you very much, and God bless.
Thank you.
thank you again to my guest today, Father James Bradley, and to my producer, Charlie Brown. And thank you to Imma Settiardi for her rendition of C.P. Bach's Solfeggetto, which opens and closes this podcast. I'm Father Paul Hayward, and you've been listening to Canonically Speaking. Please be sure to subscribe and follow wherever you get your podcasts for more interesting conversations from the world of canon law. Until the next time, thank you and God bless.